You're listening to AMI Audiobook Review on AMI Audio. I'm your host, Jacob Szymanski. I talk about audiobooks that I've listened to on the show all the time, but I'm also talking about them to pretty much everyone in my life. That doesn't mean that I want to talk about every book that I've read. Some books I just want to keep to myself. This is obviously a universal experience, but guilty pleasure books as a phenomenon is absolutely worth exploring. Ryan Delehanty is the podcast coordinator at AMI Audio, and he's here to help Nisreen and I unpack the topic and maybe share a few guilty pleasure reads of his own. How's it going, Ryan?
Good. How are you two?
I'm doing all right.
Good.
Excellent.
I'll start by defining a guilty pleasure read as a book or audiobook that you love, but you keep to yourself for whatever reason. A book that makes you embarrassed for a variety of reasons. I'll start with you, Ryan. What do you think those reasons could be?
This is something I'd thought more about in terms of music and film and maybe even a little bit of TV. I like really good, like prestige things and terrible, awful trash things. And I don't really like much in between. If it's mediocre, I'm bored. But if it's excellent, I admire it. I need more of an attention span. If I'm at a low point, I want garbage. And so, I'd maybe keep some of my, musical pop leanings a little more secret to have my, indie cred. Maybe some of the, the crappy dating shows that I might watch on TV. I won't mention as often as, the HBO dramas. But in books, there's a few maybe, and they kind of mirror some of those guilty pleasures, some of those closeted interests. And so the one that I'll put out there that's a bit of a confession is, I was briefly fascinated by the world of Scientology. And it's so toxic and awful. I found it, so intriguing. It's such an insular sort of scene, but I could only consume so much, Scientology related content before. I don't want them to know that I exist. I don't want to delve any further into that. But in a very similar way, the world of professional wrestling is so bizarre, and I prefer the behind the scenes and the drama and the intrigue to the actual product that comes out of it. But that would definitely be right up there in the guilty pleasure list. I haven't read too many audiobooks on the subject. A couple Under the Black Hat by Jim Ross I'd listened to. I've read a few books, by, Bret Hart and Chris Jericho, The Death of WCW, where they really get into the internal politics. It's like the mafia in so many ways, that they've got their own language, their own terminology. It's not, you're not really getting there on merit of being the best athlete. It's a lot of, politics, that they trust you to be their champion, to carry the company. So much backstabbing, so much interpersonal drama as storylines they develop for TV become real storylines backstage. People keep kayfabe alive, which is the act of being secretive and not letting outsiders, because it was really a hustle. It was like the traveling carnival. You've got your marks, the people that are targets, that you're trying to bilk them for their money. You don't want them to realize how choreographed and staged it all is. And so it's been such a fascinating evolution when you get the people that peel back that curtain. It's very interesting, but it's definitely a guilty pleasure. It's not the books that I would recommend to very many people, if anyone at all.
But at the start, you mentioned that there seems to be like two poles, where on one end you have your highfalutin, like high literature, like the critically acclaimed stuff, and on the other end you have what you just called trash. Would you call these books about Scientology and wrestling trash? Like, is it fair to just call it trash? Because clearly you wouldn't enjoy trash, right? Like, there's something you enjoyed about it, otherwise you wouldn't be reading it. Well, like,
sure, I think it was.
Why do you qualify it as trash even though you like it?
I think maybe the subject matter is trashy. The execution,
Yes,
the writing can be very well done. Like, I think Going Clear was a Scientology book by a very prestigious, accomplished author who does a ton of research. So the amount of effort and work and professionalism that goes into some of these is top notch. But just that you're interested in that unseemly or more scandalous sometimes a subject matter, a lot of behind the scenes. I'm a bit of a sucker for high drama. I don't want it in my personal life, but I will read about it. I will listen to it. Yeah.
Yeah, you can't deny everybody loves a little bit of goss.
I have to admit that I agree with Ryan. There are some books that I consider trash, but it's also a guilty pleasure. In that context, it's more of like the subject matter that's trash, but the writing style is very intriguing and you just keep going. And, you know, even though the subject is very, it's just, I don't want to say dumb or anything like that. It's just, it's inappropriate. It's not.
I think some topics are some subjects are just kind of dumb. I think it's fair to say. Like imagine, okay, like Ryan, imagine you're sitting next to I don't know, someone you're really looking to impress, and they ask you, "Oh, Ryan, what have you been reading recently?" Some wrestling tabloid books.
Yeah,
like it kind of reflects. Like it reflects on you, right? It's not like, oh yeah, I'm reading some treatise on Socrates' works of philosophy. You know, like it looks very different. Niz, do you have any guilty pleasure books you want to share with us?
I mean, absolutely, but at the same time, no. So I'll
confess,
start off
you should as well.
So this is exposing myself here. J. Maas books. I know a lot of people love them. I've been liking them, so I read 2, and she has so many, and I wanted to get into more. But these are not the type of books that I would recommend to others. I've been reading A Court of Thorns and Roses and House of Earth and Blood from the Crescent City series. They're not that complex. They're not really well written, but they're just easy and fun reads, and they're comfort books. So they've got enough drama and romance, magic to keep me like interested and intrigued, while being simple enough to follow without being lost. So these are the type of books that I would consider guilty pleasure. Another one I recently started reading, so I haven't finished it yet, but I started listening to Funny Story by Emily Henry, and I find this to be a very it's a romantic comedy and another guilty pleasure book. I hate to admit this, but I love the cozy small town romance books. Yes, that's out there. They're predictable, they're cliche, but cozy to read. And you know, I don't admit this to many people, but this is how it is.
You can
sometimes
enjoy
you
whatever
want to be
you
challenged.
want.
My mind doesn't want to be challenged at times. Yes.
I totally get it. Like sometimes you just want an easy book to distract you. And I heard what some people will do is they'll alternate between a challenging read and something more comfortable. And it's kind of how you keep yourself in the reading mindset. It makes you a better reader. You kind of need to rest yourself before you jump into something more complicated. Yeah. And 2 birds, 1 stone, you're also reading something you really enjoy. So you keep up your love of reading. That said, I don't think we need to be as shy and ashamed of talking about the books we love, regardless of the topic or if we consider it trash, because I'm an optimistic person and I think people just aren't as judgmental as they used to be. They're not as mean, and just people are more open-minded nowadays. We're not in the 90s. I know I've been ragging on the 90s a lot recently, but
it was
God,
cutthroat. There was a lot of backstabbing. I still have internalized a lot of that. I can anticipate the critiques coming back, and so I know to filter myself to not become a target.
Yeah, if this was the 90s and you talked about how you read books about Scientology, Ryan, you'd probably get made fun of. So would you, Niz, if you talked about your small town cozy romance books. I find romance often falls into that category of guilty pleasure books, but I think a big part of it is because it's the smut, dude. Like you don't want to you don't want to admit that you read that stuff. I have had people admit to me that they love smut, and I'm like, really? Interesting. I didn't know that about you. Why don't we get into this RFR? Rapid fire review. Ryan, you sent us 5 books. We're going to go through them one by one. You have 15 seconds to review each of them. I'm going to read the title and the author. After I read the author, you're going to hear a ticking sound. Once you hear that ticking sound, you can give us your synopsis/review. That's 15 seconds. It's a lot harder than it sounds. And of the 5 books that you gave us, a handful of them are what you would consider guilty pleasure reads. So this is going to be cool. You're all set?
Absolutely.
Okay, let's get started. Rebel Girl, My Life as a Feminist Punk by Kathleen Hanna.
So I've been a huge fan of Kathleen Hanna since her band Bikini Kill first started, and I love her albums as Julie Rune and La Tigre too. So this autobiography gets into the origins of the Riot Girl movement, her friendship with Kurt Cobain, feud with Courtney Love, being a woman in the punk scene, and finding love with the Beastie Boys ad rock and struggling with Lyme disease.
Yeah, Kathleen Hanna was a person that found herself in the middle of so many central moments in rock, being friends with Kurt Cobain and being part of Bikini Kill. Those are all bands that are like very influential. It's like she's not super famous, but it's the fact that she was in the middle of all these things that makes her kind of uniquely placed to have a really interesting memoir. It's set in a really interesting time in rock music and feminism too. All right, let's move on to the next one. All Force by Miranda July.
So this is one I'm in the middle of. Miranda was a peer of Kathleen's in around Olympia, Washington, a bit further on the fringe of the music and art scenes, a very unique creator that I followed for quite a long time with her different art projects, a film called Me and You and Everyone We Know. So she's a bit of an overthinker, and this is pseudo-autobiographical. Strange lady, but very fascinating.
What does that mean? Pseudo-autobiographical?
So I think she borrows a lot from her life, but obscures things. So she has a filmmaker, music video producer, husband, both in real life and in this book, but different names, different child's names. So I think it's, fictionalized, maybe a little bit heightened, but I think very true to her life and her experience. And she's got such a quirky kind of perspective, but one that rings very true to me. And I think she's very obsessive about kind of wanting to learn the inner lives of the people around her, as she thinks they just kind of live and perceive things in a very different way. And she wants to kind of crawl inside that. So I've always loved her work. And this one's really resonating with me about halfway through the book.
That sounds like a really interesting structure. Like it's half fictionalized, or is it's fiction that's heavily inspired by her real life experiences?
I would say the latter. So she kind of sets off on a road trip to drive cross country to meet some friends in New York, to leave LA, to maybe plan her next art project. She kind of admits to being a slightly famous sort of artist. And I think a lot of the people that resonate with me, it's more their work than their celebrity that I enjoy. And so there are these people that I might not even recognize if I were to, cross paths with them. But their work has really had a profound impact on me. And so she gets totally sidelined pretty quick into this road trip, and then spends all this money she made from having a sentence she wrote licensed for a whiskey advertisement in Japan. And she completely outfits this motel room in decadent fashion and kind of settles into this small town 5 minutes from where she actually lives at the start of this road trip. Not sure where it's going to go from there. It starts with her FBI neighbor telling her that somebody was surveilling her house with a telephoto lens, and she's kind of flattered by that, and then it kind of moves on pretty quickly from there.
Let's move on to the next book in RFR. We're at number 3. We're not following the rules, but who's going to stop us? Buddy Babylon, the autobiography of Buddy Cole by Scott Thompson.
So Scott Thompson is one of the 5 cast members in the Kids in the Hall sketch comedy show, a huge favorite of mine growing up, and Buddy Cole being one of his primary characters. So this is an autobiography, quote unquote, of Buddy's journey with his celebrity paramours and winning the prettiest feet in Quebec contest to becoming a very prominent figure. So autobiography of a fictional character. Yes, yeah. It's again pretty trashy at times, pretty sleazy, but always very entertaining.
I'd qualify that as a guilty pleasure. Not that I'm judging you.
No, absolutely.
It ticks all the boxes.
Yeah. There's certain things that you'll read that you kind of cringe and like nobody's looking over my shoulder while I read this passage. Okay, what would people think?
The worst is when you're listening to an audiobook and you're just like, God, I hope nobody can hear what's coming out of my headphones right now. This would be really embarrassing.
And this definitely is a great audiobook because it's Scott in character playing this character he played on the sketch comedy show for years, and really bringing all these bizarre stories to life.
So a fictional autobiography. I've never heard of that. That sounds really cool, actually.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun, especially if you're a fan of the show and you've seen, you've gotten to know that character of Buddy Cole, who's, quite unique. But
what was the name of the show?
Kids in the Hall. So it was a Canadian sketch comedy show that was sort of rebooted on Amazon the other year. And actually, they did a very good job of keeping the spirit of the original show. It ran for about 5 seasons from the late 80s to mid 90s.
All right, the next book is Mr. Know-It-All by John Waters.
So this is the, as he calls it, the tarnished wisdom of a filth elder. So John Waters is surely an idol of Buddy Cole and Scott Thompson, a notorious filmmaker behind Pink Flamingo's Hairspray. And this is humorous memoirs from chronicling his rise from a low-rent Oscar Wilde to a respectable filmmaker, and wondering, how did I, the trashiest man alive, become respectable and successful in my later years?
It's kind of interesting how all your 4 selections so far have been loosely tied together. Like, it seems like a lot of these people are featuring in the other books. Like, there's a through line between all of these. Would you consider this one a guilty pleasure read?
A fair bit, yeah. John Waters is definitely not for everybody. A very polarizing filmmaker. He got a little bit more pop culture notoriety with Hairspray, which was adapted into a musical. He was a character in an episode, playing himself in an episode of The Simpsons way back when. Cool. So he's always been, pretty well known, but not everybody enjoys the work where he gets into the sleazier side of things. So I always like the term lowbrow, and I think that works with some of the subject matter that they kind of delve into.
Okay, so there's a line in the synopsis for this book that I struggle to understand the context. Maybe you can explain this to me, but it does come off as sleazy, which is the word you used. Waters swears by one undeniable truth. Whatever you might have heard, there's absolutely no downside to being famous. None at all. What is he trying to say here? Should I take this at face value, or is he being facetious?
I think for him, he's probably being very honest there, in that he, I think, enjoys, because I think he's got a very different side of fame than maybe your pop musicians would, where everybody wants a piece, they're all up in your business. He's, I think, an open book. He, with the stuff he talks about, he doesn't have anything to hide. I don't think he feels any shame or guilt with his pleasures, and so I think he just enjoys the perks that come with, having that sort of notoriety and having the occasion to, mingle with his idols. And he's obsessed with a lot of, obscure old music. And so these are all people where, I found that's what I gravitated to with, getting an Audible subscription was, who am I a fan of, who I admire or really enjoy their other works, and getting to hear them read their own books. I kind of prioritize that over an author with a narrator, just something that, kind of ties into things that I've got a lot of, nostalgia and fondness for, and being able to kind of revisit some of my favorite things in music and books and TV shows through the audiobooks, through hearing these authors, read their own work, their own words. And I think it really adds a lot, where I would, prioritize the audiobook over reading that version in print, because I'm such a fan. I've loved this musician or filmmaker for so long. Yeah, I want to hear them read to me. It's so much more intimate, for 10 hours, most often with a lot of these books.
The words carry more weight if it's the author themselves reading it, especially if it's an autobiography. It seems to be like an art form of its own at this point, because it's so common for people to read their own autobiography. And the cool thing is that they tend, and this is something I've noticed, to write the way they speak. And so for them, narrating it seems more natural. It just seems more like a scripted podcast than a typical book, right? You have
very much so.
One more book here. Here's the last one. The Kid Stays in the Picture by Robert Evans.
I think this was the first one I sought out, as it became quite notorious when it first came out as an audiobook on cassette in 1994. Robert Evans, totally conceited, pretty hilarious manner of speaking and storytelling. He is the producer behind some of the biggest films from Paramount, The Godfather, Chinatown, etc. Gets into all the gossip and scandals from really one of the most creative and riskiest times in Hollywood history.
I never took you as a gossip king.
Oh yeah,
there's a lot of gossip and scandal.
I try to keep it out of my professional life, but yes.
No, it's true. Everybody loves gossip except when it starts involving them. That's it, eh? All right, so we went through these 5 books, and now the next step is for you to choose one of these 5 titles, and you can elaborate, rant, rave, whatever you want to do. You have the floor. Which of these 5 books did you want to elaborate on?
I think the freshest for me, I just finished Rebel Girl by Kathleen Hanna, so I think that would probably be the best one to delve into.
Okay, great. I actually finished this one too. Do you want to start with your thoughts?
Sure. So it was, again, stirred up a lot for me. I'd lived 2 summers in Portland, Oregon, and had a girlfriend who was very much involved in music in a band and got to go to a lot of shows. I've loved so many bands kind of around that scene, and always really admired Kathleen Hanna and her work. And she'd sort of disappeared for quite a while in between different projects as the first band dissolved. And as she, I think people weren't aware for quite a while, became quite ill and, well, had really been struggling with the effects of Lyme disease for quite a long time. So it was great just getting, this inside perspective of, so many artists from, I was obsessed with Nirvana when they were around. And so hearing, from a friend of Kurt Cobain who, she probably gets interviewed about it too much instead of her own accomplishments, but she had written, I think, on a wall somewhere, Kurt smells like Teen Spirit, which was a brand of deodorant they thought was very hilariously titled, Teen Spirit deodorant. What does that smell like? And that, he riffed on that for the song title of their biggest hit. And I think maybe because of that, there was a lot of jealousy, I think, from Courtney Love towards Kathleen Hanna that culminated in Courtney Love sucker punching Kathleen backstage at a festival show. And so getting into this memoir of, her, I think, not really feeling maybe, qualified, maybe for lack of a better term, to, be a front person of a band, but going for it. A lot of, the sort of Riot Girl feminist take, they had a very famous sort of mantra, maybe girls to the front at a rock show. They'd really encourage, instead of all the guys, slam dancing or moshing and making a hostile environment for a lot of showgoers. They'd really encourage the girls to, get up front, to be more comfortable, to be able to really enjoy and get immersed in the show. And, I've seen that even maybe 10 years ago in Halifax, a singer, I think it's Lido Pimienta, apologies if I'm mispronouncing that name, but she had said, I think, women of color to the front at that show, and a white female photographer stayed up front, and it became a little bit of a kerfuffle.
Oh, God.
But you could see sort of that legacy of this, and it's really interesting to see Kathleen sort of reanalyze how they'd approached, Riot Girl, how it grew, far beyond her to where she became sort of on the outskirts of it and became, maybe a little bit maligned.
Yeah.
In that
she was seen as like the de facto leader of Riot Girl, which was somewhat of a feminist rock collective, but she lost control of it, and it became something that she, in certain aspects of it, like really disagreed with it. When I was reading this book, the one thing that I thought was most noteworthy to me, or most interesting, was how she was a very active, outspoken, proactive feminist back in the mid to late 90s, and even up to this day, but especially back in the 90s, how you just saw how hostile people were to anything that even was like tangentially related to feminism. And she got so much pushback and threats, and she did it regardless. She was completely fearless and just someone who really stood on her convictions. And that's it. Obviously, this is an autobiography, so she's going to portray herself in a way that she thinks will make herself look good. Obviously, you want to be impartial, like you want to give it like an actual accurate depiction of yourself. But the way I read it, I saw it as I got a vibe of her character in a way that I didn't feel manipulated by her. I feel like I understand her in a way that it's not, she didn't actively make herself look better. She just, like, I really appreciate her without, I'm not trying to explain this. Like, I don't feel like she specifically painted herself in a specific way. Right? Like, I really appreciate her as a person, not in the manipulative type of autobiography way that you see sometimes.
She tries to be, I think, self-critical and look back on things where she had failed and maybe could have done better, and, you know, what she's very honest. Learned and evolved. And, you know, very, very different than, say, the Robert Evans book, where he's, you know, so full of hubris and so, you know, trying to grandstand and build himself up as like the most important person. She definitely tries to, you know, give credit where it's due with her, you know, bandmates or peers in the Riot Girl movement, the people that, you know, paved the way or that inspired her. So that's always really nice to see. And she is, you know, full of personality. I think that's why, you know, her bands resonated with so many people, was that she was, you know, often I think not over intellectualizing things, but really trying to get down to like the core of it and to have fun with it. And that's something that I think really spun out of her later bands. And, you know, I saw, you know, in the music scene here and with so many bands that were popular, just, you know, how popular, you know, misogyny was. And, you know, that was something that they really had to, you know, fight against for so long. And just how accepted, and people just kind of brush it off as, oh, boys will be boys, whatever. And, you know, it was always something that I, you know, struggled with, that I thought, you know, like, I can't be part of that. But that's where, you know, so many of the people are. Like, I'll just distance myself from that scene because that's so prevalent there. And so with the memoir, I do think she's, you know, it was a lot of fun. And so, you know, with their first band that was more punk, it was more, you know, railing against that misogyny, you know, talking about what's wrong, what the problems are, trying to address, you know, sexualized violence and all these other terrible things that were so common, and I'm sure still are. But with the later bands, I think that's kind of the problem, is when you immerse yourself in that becomes your life, and you don't want to kind of revel in that so much. That later bands is more about what's fun, what do we want to celebrate, what do we love, let's talk about what we love instead of what we hate and what we want less of.
And that's something that she has to deal with during that memoir, and she explains it in a very eloquent way too. I really like this one. That book is Rebel Girl by Kathleen Hanna. Ryan, I want to thank you so much for all your RFR selections. We'll make sure that those end up in the podcast description. And Nisreen, thanks so much for tagging along for the roundtable discussion. That's all the time we have for today's AMI audiobook review. We'll be back tomorrow around the same time, 11 a.m. Eastern. I'm your host, Jacob Szymanski. Thanks for listening.